Yeah.
We'll give you the gavel.
I'm sorry, this was taken.
You got here late. This is fine.
Yeah.
Super. We'll make sure Eric is set. Nice to meet you. How's it going?
That's good.
Yeah, cool. I was over at the baseball game on Sunday.
You went Sunday?
Yeah. I think a bunch of people were there.
How was it?
Oh, yeah.
That was a great game.
It was a great game.
Yeah.
I walked off
Ton of fun.
Oh, that was great. Yeah.
My wife's birthday, so we had
Oh,
got
nice.
some homemade seats. It was a great time.
Yeah. I don't go as much as I think we were here and do baseball. It's such a great thing.
I used to have season tickets. And I had them out at RFK when they first
Yeah.
showed up, and I shot them over at the National Park, but I just found I wasn't going. I was ending up just handing them out to people. And so I decided I'm probably paying less, but going more now. I just buy them.
Yeah.
When I can.
Baseball specials, there's just so many things. You have to really hold the time and really love. I love being a baseball fan. Really.
I don't love it.
Yeah.
I'm not. You're not doing it. Yes. I don't think I wrote that mine either. Who knows? It could come out of my mouth. I mean, there's no guarantees. He has been for years. He's not aging. It's fun to watch, I bet.
I would have written the testimony.
Yeah, I know.
But there are bits of it where it's like, how can you say that? But you don't know somebody else.
Are you shuffling? Is it like musical chairs? Did the music stop? Did the
That's
music
not
stop?
okay. That's just not okay. Well, I'm going to take my cards and go.
So we just wanted to make sure that that was on your. I knew that you.
this law.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
That was something that I wanted to introduce to people. He thought that they weren't going to necessarily take it that far. It was like, well, I think it's one side of something.
Put forward the mechanics
year watching the Super Bowl.
Well, then, like, the numbers are really fiscal. Realize we're accredited.
Of those 200, 100 are replacement regulations.
Like, the Department of Education has authority on it. So they're just doing it's like, we're not, people feel like,
Absolutely. Well, and it's like,
yeah.
which is great. I would bet you do. It's just down. Yeah, I think you're good.
You can make yourself comfortable wherever works for you.
Showing up.
She can't start until Maya shows up.
But it's not even done.
Just give me a hard time.
How long have you been sitting here? I was just sitting downstairs for 45 minutes.
Were you?
Yeah.
I've been here. Just, yeah, now.
Oh, there she is.
And I can no longer figure out what
travel times you're going to be across town with all the traffic and the metro stuff. So
Right, well, or
So I got
sometimes,
here
as
way
I
too early.
recall, you go to the wrong hotel,
I went to the wrong hotel one time.
right?
That was
Just-
awesome.
I was moderating that.
That was awesome.
Yeah, so
I
I
like
think
that
that maybe you need to leave a little bit more in
But I
advance.
do know where the Cannon building is, though. I've been here before.
Uh-huh. Okay, well,
So we got here really early, and I came in, and I crashed. No one was around, so I just made myself at home. I look up, it's delayed, and I'm like, okay, what's that mean?
well, I went down to the cafeteria to have breakfast, and they have this crazy cafeteria where there's no one who brings you up.
Oh, in Longwood?
Yeah, in this one, you
In
can't.
Cannon? Oh,
Yeah, and it's a go like charge yourself something, and I didn't know how to do it. And I thought I was stealing something, and then there were cameras, and I was really hungry because yesterday I started a diet where you have to fast every other day, so I have to eat in 24 hours. So it was a big mess. Hi, Harry. How are you? I'm talking about my challenges of trying to figure out the canteen that has anything. How are you? Of course, nice to see you.
Hi, Harry Stein. Good to meet you.
How are you? Welcome. Glad to have you here. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it. Looking forward to this.
Oh, there. Why am I going to spray this?
He's a ranking member since my Holland has checked out to run for the Senate.
There's been a coup.
This and all that?
He's not so bad. Busy.
So
My cousin is Mary Van Horn's sister. Isn't that fun? So we're family.
Remember when the Senate
aren't you a celebrity?
I know. My cousin's burgers. I'm not even sure if they are actually. I just. I know.
We
It's, I
can't
don't work
verify.
with
Tell
them.
us whatever you They changed seats. Renovation that house, but new seats.
Oh, really?
I feel that you're very close. Good. Okay, have you read the whole article?
Yours?
No. Ours for Friday.
I read it way earlier and I didn't
Yeah.
reread it.
So I've heard part of it, and I'm so glad that you picked it. It's really interesting. I was at a dinner party the other day. I brought it up to sound smart, and then all these other people already knew stuff about it. I really am a high uninformed policy, so it's free. But, and it's good. It's a totally manageable, deep, thoughtful article.
Yeah, I don't think it also gets too partisan. At least school good stuff.
Oh, yeah.
The hearing will come to order. I want to welcome all to this committee on the budget hearing, where we'll focus on the need for fiscal goals. Before we begin, I want to welcome everybody who's joining us today, and I particularly want to wish a warm welcome to the Deputy Speaker of the Parliament of Sri Lanka, Mr. Sumathapala. Mr. Sumathapala, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Today's hearing, the focus of today's hearing is on the need for Congress to establish fiscal goals to drive discipline and accountability in the budgeting process. In short, it's all about building consensus. Policymakers and the public at large need to reach a consensus on a standard or a set of standards against which we will measure our level of fiscal responsibility. Without such a consensus, we lack a sound foundation upon which to build an effective budget process. We will be destined to budgeting through trial and error, a particularly daunting prospect for a nation $19 trillion in total debt with an annual operating budget of nearly $4 trillion. From the beginning of this effort to reform the congressional budget process, I've tried to stress that this should be a bipartisan project. We all have a vested interest in a well-functioning budget process. Establishing and codifying a set of fiscal goals should help there be a bipartisan success in this endeavor. After all, if we can agree on where we aim to go from a fiscal perspective, we already have something in common, even if there are real and meaningful disagreements about how we get there, and that's where the debate ought to be. For most of our nation's early history, balancing the budget in peacetime was the consensus. It was the norm. It was a common sense position that you don't spend more than you have or than you take in. In fact, during our country's first 100 years, the budget was balanced 70% of the time, and most deficits were short-lived during activities of war. Since World War II, the budget has been balanced only 15% of the time. $19 trillion in debt is clear evidence that this standard is one the country has too often failed to follow. In the absence of adherence to a balanced budget, however, there has yet to emerge a benchmark that achieves a consensus among policymakers and the public. And today's hearing will examine whether we should seek to reestablish a simple balanced budget standard, modify that standard to reflect different budgeting priorities, or choose a different fiscal goal altogether. There are a variety of potential fiscal goals that could be under consideration, including a balanced budget that would ensure the annual operating expenditures of the federal government do not exceed revenues while still allowing for borrowing to fund capital investments. Other ideas include determining what is a sustainable level of debt as it relates to the economy and the country's ability to service that debt while maintaining flexibility to respond to the unforeseen. We could also limit growth in spending to a level less than or certainly no faster than growth in the economy. Caps on discretionary or automatic spending or some other goal that can secure the support and trust of the American people. Whatever benchmark this country adopts, the integrity of the standard will require defining the terms and enforcing the goals, remaining vigilant against attempts to reclassify spending in order to get over, under, or around any enforcement mechanisms. In a dynamic, dangerous, and complex world, there will naturally be exceptions made, but exceptions, by definition, must not become the routine. We establish goals in order to build and maintain consensus, which is essential to effective governance and accountability. Goals also keep our eyes trained on the long-term challenges and consequences of policymaking. Short-sighted decision-making is far too often the common theme in this town. We need fiscal goals that will inform a budget process that, however we go about achieving those goals, puts the country on a sustainable path. Our fiscal goals should serve a purpose beyond an accounting exercise. They should be supportive of a healthy economy and fair to current and future generations of taxpayers. They should also aid in promoting certainty for policymakers, for taxpayers, for businesses and individuals and families. And to help illuminate and inform this discussion, we are so pleased to have our three witnesses here today. We have Maya MacGuineas, the president of the Committee for Responsible Budget, Harry Stein, who's the director of fiscal policy at the Center of American Progress, and Doug Holtz-Eakin, a former CBO director and now president of the American Action Forum. I want to thank you all for being here today. You bring a wealth of knowledge and information about these issues, and we look forward to your testimony and the discussion that will follow. And I'm pleased to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Yarmouth, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We appreciate the effort that you've put into this topic. I would also like to welcome our foreign dignitaries, Deputy Speaker Samantha Pala and Deputy Secretary General Adewale. I'm glad that you could join us today. Also, welcome to the witnesses. I look forward to your testimony. This is now the third hearing we've had on budget reform in the past month, and as we understand it, you plan on having several more hearings on this subject over the next few weeks. But the truth is that until we change the political dynamics that have stopped any action on the House budget, we will never make any progress. Budget process reforms cannot replace the lack of political will. And we all know that the Republican majority has not been able to bring their own budget to the floor because of their fractured party, not a fractured process. Reforming the budget process isn't going to fix that hyperpartisanship and often irrational opposition to compromise. So since our Republican colleagues can't pass their budget despite being in the majority, I guess it's healthy to have hearings like this. My Democratic colleagues and I agree that it's good to have fiscal goals. A lot of people would call that a budget. But arbitrary targets are not substitutes for making responsible and informed decisions about how we should fund federal programs and invest in the future of our country. None of this is new. Deficit controls enacted in the 1980s were not successful. Targets, which had been arbitrarily drawn without any thought to policy, soon proved unrealistic and were changed. We are experiencing that right now to a certain extent with sequestration. And my colleagues on the other side were all for sequestration levels until, and some of them still are, but understanding that they had to live with the consequences of dramatic funding cuts to programs that the American people support, and even the chairman of the Appropriations Committee has said that the sequestration levels were unsustainable. But we know what works. We've seen it before when Democrats and Republicans worked together, compromised, and balanced the budget under President Clinton. Again, we support the idea of having goals. But as I recall William F. Buckley Jr. saying once upon a time, idealism is nice, but when it confronts reality, the costs become prohibitive. And that's what we have to guard against. Mr. Chairman, we all know that one wing of your party isn't willing to compromise, but we can be the willing partner needed to pass a budget. And happy to be, as we have been in the past, most recently last fall. We would just need to refocus this committee's attention to the actual task at hand. So I thank you and look forward to the testimony. I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman, and Ms. Maya MacGuineas, Mr. Stein, and Dr. Holtz-Eakin, I want to welcome you once again today. The committee has received your written statements, and they will be made part of the formal hearing record. You will each have 5 minutes to deliver your opening remarks, oral remarks, and Ms. Maya MacGuineas, you may begin when you're ready.
Great, thank you. Is this on? Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Ranking Member and members of the committee. Thank you for having me here today to talk about the important fiscal issues, including whether we should have a fiscal goal in the budget. And it's really nice to be joined by the dignitaries from Sri Lanka, because I think international lessons, we can draw a lot from international lessons on this. That's one reason. The second reason is I've just decided to make my children start learning the capitals of countries around the world, and we did Sri Lanka last night, so I'll be able to tell them this story. So I'm Maya MacGuineas. I run the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget and the Campaign to Fix the Debt. My written testimony makes several main points. One, our deficit and debt problems are far from solved. Two, there are many advantages to getting the debt to more manageable levels. Three, having a fiscal goal is a key part of budgeting. Four, a fiscal goal should be aggressive enough to help fix the problem, but realistic enough to be achievable. 5, fiscal goals should be accompanied by procedures to achieve the goal and stay on track. And 6, a fiscal goal should include enforcement mechanisms, which can be done through carrots or through sticks. So let me touch on a few of those main points now. While deficits have declined since the Great Recession due to economic improvements and some policy changes, the debt remains at near record levels. Right now, it's higher than it's been at any time other than coming out of World War II. It's twice our historical average. It's twice where it was when we went into the Great Recession. Deficits are now projected to grow every year indefinitely. The fastest growing part of our budget is interest payments. Not making situations better, last year, Congress added $1 trillion to the debt, so we are moving in the wrong direction. Such high debt levels can harm economic growth, wages, the standard of living, and very worryingly, it leaves us very vulnerable to the next economic crisis, recession, or emergency. So establishing a fiscal goal can be an important first step towards making fiscal improvements. I think it's a necessary first step. Fiscal goal there are a number of advantages. It can guide a budget onto a sustainable path, something we haven't been on for quite some time. It can provide a measure of accountability that does not currently exist. It forces the budget discussion to include the central discussions about budgetary trade-offs, and that's what budgeting really is. It pushes policymakers to prioritize and to go through the exercise of determining whether a policy is worth it or not, and whether it's worth the costs. These exercises are often just not done at all when we rely too heavily on deficit financing. Fiscal goal can be used to help push aside short-term, often more political concerns, and focus on long-term priorities. It can be used as a public education tool, which is something we've seen in other countries is very important for helping countries to stay on track and achieving fiscally responsible plans. And it can serve as a guidepost to get back to fiscal health after an economic downturn or other factors may force us to move away from any goal. So importantly, there is no singular right level of deficit or debt, and accordingly, there's no right fiscal goal. I think a reasonable fiscal goal should be aggressive enough to improve our fiscal situation. Again, we have to get off of these record debt levels, but it has to put the debt on a sustainable path. Sustainable means not growing faster than the economy, but it has to be reasonable, it has to be achievable. The more we miss our fiscal targets, the more we don't achieve them, the more undermined that whole process becomes. So looking at our current budget projections, it appears right now that our fiscal goal is that we should start at a near record debt level. Over the next 10 years, add $10 trillion to the debt. Ultimately, in 10 years, be at $1.3 trillion deficits and debt levels of 84% of GDP. So I'm just going to start with the belief that none of us think that's the right fiscal goal, that we should pick something better than that. So my written testimony includes several potential fiscal goals, and it goes through the amount of savings that you would need to achieve them, everything from balancing the budget over 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, achieving different debt target levels over certain amounts of time, and again, how much you'd have to save. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A if that's interesting or helpful to people. Just a couple final thoughts. Fiscal goals are not a substitute for policy choices. They are an excellent first step. They work much better when they are done in conjunction with policy choices. Goals and accompanying rules always work best when there's a big budget deal that goes along with them, and something we've observed from past budget deals that have made them most effective is that they're multi-year and generate real significant amounts of savings. They deal with the structural problems in the budget, including entitlements and revenues, and they're accompanied by a public dialogue. The more the public understands about what we're trying to do and can hold us accountable, the more likely we are to succeed. Any fiscal rule has to be flexible enough to be modified or suspended whenever there's a crisis or a downturn, and then there should be provisions to offset those higher deficits so that we can get back on track. Fiscal rules that help compliance with those goals, so the rules that help stay on track, increase the likelihood of success. Rules can be structured to avoid rolling back parts of a budget deal, or they can be structured to pressure Congress and the President to put in place a budget deal. So I'm going to end by just saying, all around us right now in this country, there is so much concern about breakdown in Washington, the breakdown about our ability to govern. And I really believe that the budget is the first step in showing that we can govern, showing that we can make choices, and showing that we can get together and come to solutions that both sides can agree to and stick to. I think a fiscal goal can help start that framework. And the bottom line is that to govern is to choose, and we need to get back to letting the budget help guide us to do that. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Stein, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Price and Congressman Yarmouth, members of the committee, for inviting me to testify here today. My name is Harry Stein. I'm the Director of Fiscal Policy at the Center for American Progress. But before coming to CAP, I was a legislative assistant here on Capitol Hill for Senator Herb Kohl. And let me just say it really is an honor and a privilege to be here today and testify before this committee. I think it's absolutely fair to say, as we've heard, that our federal budget policy has been less than ideal in recent years. That would be an understatement. And I'd like to offer 3 points for your consideration as we think through the kinds of fiscal goals that we ought to be setting. So first, a federal budget that responds to the economy is a source of national strength. And just looking back at last month, we had 1.9 million American workers who remained unemployed even though they'd been trying to find a job for at least 27 weeks. That's just a terrible waste, and it's something that fiscal goals ought to be addressing. One fiscal goal that ought to have bipartisan support is to boost infrastructure investment. I think we all know that our roads and bridges and water systems need repair, and deferring this necessary maintenance only leaves a larger burden to future generations. There's never going to be a better time than right now to invest in infrastructure. I checked the other day, 5-year Treasury rates are negative after adjusting for inflation. That means that investors are literally paying to loan America money, and Americans need jobs. And when we look back at the historical data, we see that when borrowing is used responsibly, it can be an effective fiscal tool to reduce volatility and increase economic growth. Now, as the economy changes, fiscal policy needs to change as well. And we know that over time, fiscal policy has to address the aging population and the projected rise in healthcare costs. I want to be clear that I agree that our long-term fiscal challenges are real. And last year, Center for American Progress put forward a long-term budget plan that offers one possible solution, but there are many other alternatives. I would just recommend that with persistently weak demand and very low interest rates, long-term deficit reduction should be phased in gradually and once the economy's returned to full strength. Fiscal goals can help guide long-term decisions, but I'd caution against using fiscal goals to force those decisions, and that brings me to my second point. Automatic enforcement mechanisms do not increase congressional power. They're delegating that power to other agencies. A balanced budget amendment to the Constitution would give fiscal power to federal courts. And as we saw with sequestration in 2013, but I think this would be true of any automatic reductions, it was the executive branch that determined how to implement those across-the-board cuts. It's true that mandatory programs are not subject to annual appropriations, but it's also true that Congress changes those programs quite frequently. And there's several examples that I list in my written testimony, but one that I'd like to focus on is the Affordable Care Act. So the ACA made sweeping reforms to Medicare and to Medicaid, and due in part to the ACA, Medicare spending projections have fallen dramatically. And I think you can look back at CBO's projections from 2009 to see just how dramatic that decline has been. So right now, actual spending on federal health programs in 2016 is going to be less than CBO projected it would be back in those earlier 2009 projections. Remember that that was before the ACA was passed, so those 2009 projections included nothing for the coverage expansion in the ACA, which has already helped over 20 million Americans get health insurance. We're covering more people and spending less money. So we've made progress. I absolutely agree that more needs to be done. My third point is that it's political polarization, not the budget process, that stands in the way of other attempts to change fiscal policy. Enacting President Obama's budget for fiscal year 2017 would reduce deficits by $2.4 trillion over 10 years, according to CBO. And when Congress passes budget resolutions, those have endorsed even more aggressive deficit reduction goals. We have not had a shortage of ambitious fiscal goals. We have had a shortage of compromise. As we've heard, fiscal compromise has to include both spending and revenues. And unfortunately, in my view, a majority of the members of this House have signed a pledge that swears to oppose any increases in revenue. And I would note that there's no similar pledge that I'm aware of to reduce any and all spending cuts. Rigid fiscal rules have not succeeded in forcing compromise. And we've tried. Lawmakers tried using the debt ceiling to force a grand bargain, and then tried again using the supercommittee. But instead of a grand bargain, as we know, we got sequestration, which was never supposed to actually happen. Fiscal goals can help guide fiscal policy, but in a divided government, both sides are going to have to be willing to compromise. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Stein. Mr. Holtz-Eakin, please, your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Yarmouth, and members of the committee. It's a privilege to be here, and I applaud the committee for undertaking this effort to reform the budget process. The current process is simply deeply flawed. The timetable of reports, resolutions, appropriations that were laid out in the '74 Budget Act is essentially a theoretical proposition rarely actually seen on Capitol Hill. And the focus on annual discretionary spending is reflective of the origins of the Budget Act. That was the majority of spending at the time, but leaves us with the reality that about 2/3 of spending is now on autopilot and not regularly subjected to the budgetary discipline and the trade-offs that a process is supposed to produce. And indeed, if you really think about it, the federal government simply does not have a budget. It occasionally has a congressional budget resolution. Sometimes it only has a House budget resolution. Sometimes it only has a Senate budget resolution. But never does it have something that has engaged the executive, the House, and the Senate simultaneously with a meaningful dialogue to set a set of goals. And as a result, we don't really have budgets. We have budgetary outcomes, generally bad. And I think reforming that it would be an entirely desirable thing. And in recent years, we've even seen the process fail so dramatically that the government's been shut down. So I just really applaud the effort to rethink how we go about setting up our budgetary deliberations. I would just emphasize that I think Maya is much more optimistic about the budget outlook than I am. Yeah, about the only thing that has changed since I was the CBO director in 2003 is that what used to be labeled a long-term budget outlook, a debt spiral that threatens the financial stability of the federal government and the economy underneath it, is now the budget outlook. All we've done is change the dates, and it's now here. It's within the 10-year budget window. When we go out 10 years, we've got interest as the third largest federal program behind Social Security and Medicare, ahead of national defense. We are borrowing essentially to pay off previous borrowing, and for that to be the state of fiscal affairs is a dangerous and unacceptable situation. Process reforms that support getting better budgetary outcomes are 100% to be desired. I want to just make sure that, and for purposes of terminology, we're real clear that there's a big difference between fiscal rules, those things which would bind a current and future Congress, and fiscal goals, things which the Congresses select and try to drive the budget toward and enforce using the tools at their disposal. Fiscal rules would have to be constitutional in nature, in my view, in the U.S. There is evidence from around the globe that these have been effective for other countries that had chronic problems of large deficits and debt, but that's really not what I think we should be talking about today. I think we should be talking about what is it that you can embed in something like a budget resolution as the goal, and how can you go about using that to improve budgetary outcomes. I think this is desirable. Right? First, having a fiscal goal in the budget resolution forces the members of the committee, the members of the Congress, to try to figure out what they're trying to accomplish and explain it to the American public. And that goal becomes a very transparent thing. Deviations from the goal, failures and successes, are observed by the public, observed by voters, and that's a desirable thing, to get some feedback as to the effectiveness of the budget process. And if you've got a fiscal goal, you know what you're trying to enforce, and enforcement procedures can be set up to drive toward that fiscal goal. So, some simple examples of goals, you mentioned some, Mr. Chairman, in your opening remarks. I mean, you could have the goal to be to balance the budget every year. Very simple goal, very transparent, success and failure easily measured. It could be balance the budget over 10 years. We want to get to balance it in the 10th year. It could be to simply target a desirable level of spending, maybe mandatory spending, growth rate of the spending relative to the economy. That's a goal that one could put in. Or you could do one that I think has particular virtue, which is try to target the amount of debt in the hands of the public as a fraction of GDP. Right? That is the problem. We have high levels of debt that are projected to increase. The denominator of that measure is how well our economy performs. So if you undertake pro-growth policies that reduce deficit spending, you'll improve that in two ways. And so things like that, I think, are entirely desirable. It would be good to stabilize the debt as quickly as possible and get it on a downward trajectory. No one knows the right number, but we know we're going in the wrong direction. I really appreciate the chance to be here today. Look forward to your questions.
I thank all three of you for your testimony. I think it sets up well the conversation that we're about to have. I do want to just chide my my friend slightly, the ranking member, who criticizes us for not getting a budget done, and I plead guilty to that. But I also want to point out that it's an equal opportunity offender, as the last time that the Democrats were in control, they weren't able to get a budget done either. So clearly, this isn't a partisan issue in terms of getting a budget accomplished. As you said, Mr. Holtz-Eakin, we don't have a budget. We don't have a budget. We don't, and we haven't had for years. And so that the goal of these hearings is to try to enlighten us and try to help us figure out exactly what path we ought to be moving on, and what kind of fiscal goal might help us get on that path. I want to talk about a number of different areas, and I want to start with the balanced budget amendment. There's a lot of support. Balanced budget amendment has come to the vote has come to the floor of the House on a number of occasions. It's an easily explainable metric, and it makes a whole lot of sense to folks back home. They have a balanced budget in their house or in their business, or they aren't long economically viable. So, Ms. MacGuineas, I would ask you, we could try to have a fiscal goal as an amendment to the Constitution. We could try to have a goal as a statute. We could try to have a goal included in a budget resolution or in a rule. Any preference for where the fiscal goal ought to reside in our governance structure?
Yeah, my preference would be to have a statutory goal, not a constitutional goal, and I'll tell you why. I would like I said, I'd like a goal to be as reasonable, as aggressive as possible while still being reasonable and economically smart. So that is the issue of balancing the budget. And the question is, if we're going to balance the budget, which I believe we should at some point, what's a reasonable amount of time to get there? But putting the BBA in the Constitution concerns me because I see this as replacing the actual effort to get some fiscal deal in place. In that, a constitutional amendment will take so long to do. We know that, to go through the states. The amount of time that it will take to get this ratified will be years. That I'm worried members will say, well, we're working on the BBA instead of putting together the deal that would actually get us there. And so I'm afraid that that buys time to procrastinate instead of pushes us to get something done. The second thing is I regularly do see people talking about a balanced budget amendment, and those same people have no plan for how they would actually reach balance. So I think it is incumbent on anybody who talks about balancing the budget or any of the other fiscal goals that we would talk about to also at least be able to show how they would get there. So many of my board members, we have differences on the balanced budget amendment. Many say it's a bad idea whose time has come, but my preference is to try to pick something else that we could get done sooner.
Thank you. Mr. Holtz-Eakin, do you agree with that? I think you probably do, given your testimony talking about fiscal goal being included in a budget resolution. But do you agree with that, one? And two, if you do prefer that either in statute or in a resolution, how do you prevent from the fiscal goal changing every 12 months?
You don't. And so I would say that the track record of sticking to statutory fiscal goals is quite poor. I'm old enough to remember the original Graham-Rudin-Hollings, which got missed badly and got revised. The SGR was a fiscal goal. Congress every year had to, quote, fix it because they just couldn't adhere to it. The Budget Control Act has already been overcome by events in many ways and has been modified twice. So, you know, I think it's always seems better to just legislate as opposed to deal with the Constitution. But if you want to genuinely bind current and future Congresses, the only way to do it is through some sort of constitutional mechanism. If you go that route, I think the balanced budget amendment is the one to go for. I mean, if you're going to have a fiscal rule, something binding in that way, it should be very simple, as you mentioned. The public has to understand and buy into it, and they're not going to buy into Holtz-Eakin's debt as a fraction of GDP. I mean, that's just not suitable for that kind of effort. And I think that, you know, I'm a PhD in economics, so I've had the common sense trained out of me. But I have come to the conclusion that this is not the horrific thing that many people fear. For example, right now we have enormous deficits, but it would take a long time to get it ratified by the states, and that would provide you a glide path to get serious about it so that you don't have to overnight close that gap, which could be quite damaging economically. You can write one with sufficient flexibility that in times of war or severe economic distress, you can get a temporary timeout from the budget.
Yeah, I think there are a number out there that have.
So I thought the purpose of the hearing was to discuss what we could get done in the context of the budget resolution. Yeah. That's one set of propositions, but there's another one which is to really genuinely bind hands. And if so, I think constitutional amendment that balances the budget is the right one to look for.
Let me raise one that a fiscal goal that I've become interested in, and that is not having the government grow at a faster rate or a larger rate than the economy itself. So, for example, where our growth is now around the 2% range, and government's growing in 4, 5, 6% range, depending on how you count it. What that means is that the government is ever increasing in size relative to the economy. Would requiring the government not to grow any faster than the economy, Ms. MacGuineas, is that a reasonable fiscal goal? Is that something that over time might actually assist us in getting to balance in and of itself?
Yeah, I mean, that's something I've actually been really intrigued with recently as well, because and the person who's written about this the best and the most is Gene Sterling at the Urban Institute. But we have so much built-in growth in our budget, and that is where the bulk of the problem lies. And as a result, when we want to slow the growth of something, even so it's still growing faster than the economy, it's called cutting spending, and it becomes very difficult to do. So on one hand, I lean very strongly to limiting the growth so that nothing could grow faster than the economy, because by definition it's not sustainable. That said, and this is important, with the aging of society as it is and the entitlement programs that we have created, it would be very hard to stick with that now. I kind of wish we'd put that in a long time ago, and it had helped us to put entitlements on a sustainable path. But if we were to make those changes, and again, I wouldn't want to ignore the aging of the population, and I wouldn't want the result to be we squeeze out public investments already more than we already have, because that's troubling to me. I'd like to look at how we allocate our resources. But I'm not worried about Congress being able to come in and increase spending when you see fit. At least if you built in a plan where nothing grew faster than the economy, and then you left it up to your discretion to add spending when you needed to, I feel pretty confident the spending would get added. So I would be more comfortable looking at some real spending limits that have to do with tying to growth.
One of the consequences of that, I think, might be to align folks in this town in trying to increase growth in the economy, because it would then have as a byproduct the opportunity to increase federal spending. Mr. Holtz-Eakin, there have to be other countries that have gotten this right, I would suspect. Any countries stand out in terms of utilizing a fiscal goal that actually, one, works, and two, that they're able to adhere to?
I think the Canadian experience in the late 90s and early 2000s is really one of the things that's worth studying carefully. That was a situation where debt to GDP was very high, growth was bad, and they had real weakness in their currency, and they not only managed to run sort of surpluses on a regular basis and have rainy day funds essentially to help them with unexpected bad outcomes. It turned into good politics, and parties on both sides of the Canadian aisle supported this, and as they took power in their system, continued it. Now, it's broken down somewhat in recent years, so nothing's perfect, but I thought that was a good experience. The other piece that it had that I thought was very important is a lot of federalism. They actually consciously decided there were some things that the federal government wasn't going to be good at fixing, so they basically pushed it out to the provinces and said, that's your problem, and got better outcomes in that way. And I think it's a model worth looking at.
Mm-hmm. Ms. MacGuineas, any thoughts on countries that have gotten it right?
Well, it's interesting. I think what we've seen, and the IMF, again, has done the best work on this, is that if there's four basic areas of rules, so it's debt targets, balanced budget amendments, spending caps, and revenue targets, what most countries are moving towards is a combination of debt targets and spending caps. I think that may work the best, certainly where we've seen elsewhere, but I think there's one problem here, which is there's not going to be a big political compromise that just looks at spending and doesn't look at revenues. And I think it's really important that be recognized in a fiscal goal, because there's economic challenges, there's policy challenges, and there's political challenges. That said, I think if we look at spending targets and how they allow us to shift our resources, again, we're spending a lot in one area of the budget in entitlement programs, and we're underinvesting in other areas. But if we use spending caps that allow some flexibility to shift resources also, I think there's a potential there to look at that, but combining them with what I think and what Doug was saying is the most important fiscal target is the debt target, because that's the one that's the most economically meaningful.
Great. Thank you very much. Wonderful discussion, and I look forward to the questions and discussion to come. Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for their testimony. I just want to clarify one thing, one thing that Ms. MacGuineas said and one thing that you said, Mr. Chairman. Just for the record, I understand you to say that last year the deficit was $1 trillion?
No, last year, Congress and the President passed and signed legislation that added $1 trillion to the debt.
Okay, because the deficit last year was $438 billion, down from 1.4.
Yes, what I had said is the deficit came down dramatically after the Great Recession as the economy improved.
Oh, absolutely. And just in terms of Mr. Chairman, again, to set the record straight, in 2009, the government total outlays $3.5 trillion. In 2015, total outlays of $3.7 trillion. So over that period of time, the increase in the size of government, if you're meaning by size of government, total expenditures actually increased by a very small percentage over that pardon me? Did that include the stimulus? Well, that's total spending over that period of time, yeah. So it's a fraction of a small percentage. I want to get to this notion of setting goals without figuring out policy. One of the things that we know, for instance, would have a very dramatic impact on deficits would be to pass comprehensive immigration reform. And that obviously is a very speculative idea in this current environment. But many of the policies that we might implement that have dramatic effect on budget deficits, again, are subject to political will. So, Mr. Stein, how do you set a meaningful goal when you don't have policies? And I think you even referenced this, Ms. MacGuineas, about how do you get there. So how do you do this effectively?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that you don't want to put the cart before the horse and set goals without having a sense of what the policies would be. I think as we've been discussing, that goal would have to include both spending and revenues. And I think as we've seen, that's going to be really tough. So I think your point is absolutely right that the place to look is what about some growth-enhancing policies? What about some reforms that don't necessarily get at this spending versus revenues question? Immigration reform is a great example here. It grows the economy. It reduces deficits. That deficit reduction increases over time. In the long term is really where we have the biggest issues. And criminal justice reform is another example, not as large in scope for savings, but a bipartisan effort that would also result in some savings.
Thank you. Do either of the other two witnesses want to comment on that? Mr. Holtz-Eakin, you want to?
Sure. I mean, I think I agree with your point, and it was a point that I was making before, which is I think this is a two-part negotiation that has to be done together, not separately. The goal of a fiscal goal is not to pass one, and agreeing on a fiscal goal is going to be very difficult. We work with a lot of members of Congress, and there are very different preferences about what we should be trying to achieve. So it's no small feat to agree on one, and the benefit is then you would have to put forth budgets that discuss those trade-offs. It's why I'm always interested to see when the Progressive Caucus and the RSC put out their budgets, because it helps us see different trade-offs. But if you have a negotiation where you first agree on the fiscal goal and immediately or at the same time turn to the policies to get there, and that's your policy discussion, that I think is the ideal process. If you pass a fiscal goal, pat yourselves on the back, say that your job is done, and go home, we're not going to get anywhere. So fiscal goal should not take the foot off the accelerator in any way.
I would just echo the importance of having a goal that incorporates the benefits of economic growth, whether it's spending as a fraction of the economy or debt as a fraction of the economy. You always want to reward those policies that produce better growth. And, you know, I understand that, you know, having a policy solution is always better than having a budgetary guideline, but unless you're going to roll, you know, congressional reform into your budget reform, the reality is you have committees of jurisdiction that will decide policy, and so you should be thinking about things like debt as a fraction of GDP, where lots of different policies could produce better outcomes in that framework, and then have that second part of the discussion about what policies you're actually going to implement.
In any of these processes that we've talked about today, there is going to be some, by definition, limitation on spending. You talked directly about spending caps. What happens then in a time of recession? You're surrendering, it seems to me, one of the tools we have to combat recession by doing this. How do you accommodate that need?
Anyone? You should not do that. You should not surrender the fiscal tool. That is one of the necessary tools of responding to a recession. And it's one of the reasons I'm so worried about our excessively high debt levels right now. We are going to face another recession, and we are not equipped to the way we were in 2008. But you need to have escape valves. I think when you talk about balancing the budget, for instance, balancing the budget over a business cycle is how you should talk about it, certainly not on an annual level. You want to keep that flexibility there. I also think another interesting area is looking to tying some fiscal rules to the economic performance so that you have stimulus measures that phase in and phase out, just like automatic stabilizers do, kind of on how the economy is performing. But you don't want to lose that tool.
Mr. Stein?
I would absolutely agree with that. I think that it's very important to have the budget have the flexibility that it needs to respond to not only recessions, which I think the business cycle is the clearest example, but also wars, natural disasters, other emergencies. And I think the more that you try to put break points around that, the harder it is to balance, to make the budget do what it needs to do in the present time. And I would cite the Great Recession as a perfect example of this, where you could imagine a rule that was designed imagining a recession of a certain length and a certain depth. We still have an output gap. We still haven't fully recovered from the Great Recession. We've been growing, but not enough. And you could imagine a fiscal rule even over a 5-year or even 10-year time horizon, giving some flexibility, being inadequate to meet the needs that we see now.
Going to the question of the expense side, and most of our discussions seem to deal with the spending side and not the revenue side. But as we pointed out in the hearing last week, tax expenditures actually are a bigger percentage of our expenditures than both Medicare and Medicaid combined, Social Security, defense, well over $1 trillion a year. Is there any way we could develop a process that doesn't have to deal with the revenue side and specifically with tax expenditures?
Absolutely. I think that there's a lot of alternatives to give tax expenditures a more regular review. There's alternatives where you look at all of the programs that exist to accomplish a certain goal, say education, and we have both spending programs and tax programs, but we don't tend to look at those together. I think looking at those together might give you a better sense of how to strategically accomplish what we're trying to do in the most efficient way. Maybe that's with tax expenditures, maybe it's with spending programs. And I think generally speaking, it's good that we produce at least now estimates of what tax expenditures cost, how much of a subsidy they deliver. But we need to put more attention on that in the budget process and recognize all of the ways that really it's sort of a hidden size of government when we have tax expenditures. And in a way, you could almost think of that as revenue raised and then immediately spent to support whatever goal we're trying to accomplish.
Either of the other two witnesses want to comment on that?
I think it's really important, if you think of it that way, think of it as revenue raised and then spent, it is yet another form of mandatory spending. And in the end, the lesson I was taught by Henry Aaron at Brookings, among many others, is you should budget for your problem. No budget process can be perfect, but you should budget for the problem you have. The problem the federal budget has is mandatory spending. And it is one thing to worry about the mismatch of the top line and the revenues. It's just as important to recognize that the rise in mandatory spending is crowding out the annual discretionary accounts that contain national security, basic infrastructure, education, research, all the things that our founders saw as the role of government are now imperiled in a budgetary sense. And I think that's what you should focus on getting a handle on.
I want to follow up on one thing you said when talking about the Canadian experience, and you talked about pushing, I assume you're talking about pushing some budgetary items onto the provinces as opposed to the federal government. Do you think that's realistic in this country? Do you think, I mean, there are not many states that are in incredibly solvent positions right now.
I think on a program-by-program basis,
necessarily
you
suggested
could.
that we do that, but
No, you can't push everything. There are things which are fundamentally federal in nature, the tax code, for example, but there are other things which I think could easily, which historically have been handled by states, whether they are low-income assistance programs or Medicaid, which has state components to it, where we might want to think about allowing the states to address problems in ways that match their populations.
thank you very much for your responses, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Bratt, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I got a balanced budget amendment thing here. I need John and Bill and Jim to vote for, so I'm going to try to be nice today. But you all got my blood pressure up with other comments that I can't let pass. So I'll do a 1-minute version on that, on what can be done. Just as a reminder, current GDP growth is 0.8%, it's right now, 38,000 jobs last month. Infrastructure is a great thing. We all want infrastructure. The whole problem is when you have 0.8% growth and 38,000 jobs from your macroeconomy, the private sector can't invest in anything right now. And if you go knock doors, a few thousand doors, like us guys have to do, you'll find every small business, it's not partisan. No one will invest in anything right now. So the federal government all of a sudden magically has the power to make huge investments when no one in the private sector will. I mean, it's a little curious. Also on infrastructure, we have $100 trillion in unfunded liabilities. If we don't solve that thing, there won't be any spending. In 10 years, all federal revenues will go to mandatory spending, right? In 10 years, it's over. And so in the midst of this, we're saying let's do Keynesian stimulus and go more into debt right now because we have $100 trillion unfunded out there. It's over. In 10 years, we have no money for the military, infrastructure, education, transportation, nothing, right? Until we set some of these targets. So that's why this does matter, and you can sort out the policy later. On the revenue side, I mean, I'll bargain, you give me a good bargain, but there's a graph we put up, we laughed on the other day. Revenues for the last 100 years have been 20% of GDP. You're not going to change that, right? There's an upper bound, and then people work under the table, whatever, right? So you can try to do that. We had 80, 90% marginal tax rates, 28% marginal tax rates, 20%, right? Revenue as the share of the economy. Immigration, I just cannot let stand, right? Immigration, of course, grows the economy because you add labor. Find me any study that says it increases income per capita, which is the only thing people care about, after transfers. You can't find it because it's not true. So, of course, immigration increases the size of the economy because you add another person to the labor pool. But it doesn't help with any of these problems. It makes them worse. I mean, it's just fact, right? I love everybody who wants seminary. I love everybody in the world, all children of God. But we're talking facts here, right? The average person coming in from the border makes about 20 grand a year, right? They're going to get earned income tax credit. They're going to get paid. Robert Rector shown, right? Everyone's going to get up about $38,000 total in benefits. If you've got 2 kids in school, that's at the federal level only. If you got kids in school, that's an extra 13 grand a year per kid. Who's paying the bill? Right? We're done in 10 years, and we're going to add on to that bill, not subtract from it. So those are just in passing. I think we do need to, as Dr. Holtz-Eakin said, get at a balanced budget amendment. It may take time. Your critique is legit. It's going to take, but there is kind of an on-ramp here. And so 80% of Americans think the federal government should have a balance to balance its budget, right? 85% of our constituents. So it seems that's always a good place to start with what the American people think is reasonable. In 2011, 2/3 of senators split their votes between 2 versions of a balanced budget amendment. 65% of House members either voted for or co-sponsored one. So that's a hint. We've got some meat to get some of this through. I've proposed the simplest BBA that is bipartisan, and it doesn't try to tack down the policy rules ahead of time. It just sets the goal, and you work it out. Basic form, 3 points. Expenditures and receipts shall be balanced. 2/3 for emergency spending for limited times. Third, implementing legislation allows up to 10 years after ratification to get to balance. So 10-year balanced budget, it takes account of the business cycle, emergencies, whatever. It doesn't force the particulars in policy on anybody. We're just agreeing to that proposition that in 10 years, at some point in time, you got to balance. And I missed the opportunity. One of the questions up here, do we need tools? Do we need budget tools if you get in a recession? I mean, it's the cart dragging the horse. Of course you need tools if you're in a recession. Follow John Maynard Keynes, not known to be the right-wing economist of our century, right? The tool you have to use in bad times is called a surplus, right? That's what he said to do. Keynes said, right? You run a surplus, if you get bad times, you can deficit finance. So that the fact that we're in a horrendous scenario and we're asking about tools to dig yourself out of a pit you've dug it's backwards. Back to the balanced budget amendment. I've given you 8 seconds to speak. Sorry about that. You got my blood pressure up. But in general, we're just trying to put a BBA together that does not force any policies, just gets us to balance in 10 through a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, and then we'll deal with the policies later.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. McDermott, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following Mr. Bratt's fun, our great senator from the state of Washington, Henry Jackson, used to say, I'm looking for a one-armed economist, because they all say on the one hand this and on the other hand that. And the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, set up the House of Representatives and said that the Congress shall have the power to lay taxes and collect taxes and to borrow money against the federal credit. The power is here. Now, when I was Ways and Means Chairman in the state of Washington, I've been on Ways and Means committees and budget committees since 1970, in legislatures and then up here, and it's always the same argument. When I got to be the chairman in 1970, I said the biggest problem of a balanced budget amendment, state of Washington, and the legislature says we got this. So I said, let's have an independent decide what the number is, and we'll live with it. Well, and I worked with the Republicans. I didn't do it alone because the Republicans and I had to get it through, and we got it through. And that stops a lot of what most everybody wants up here. The reason we don't have a balanced budget amendment is people sign those resolutions, but they don't want it to happen because they want to have the ability to go out and get more money and borrow money and do all kinds of stuff. So there is no mechanism that you can put in place. If we put in a independent revenue estimator and said to them, you can't use the Laffer curve, well, that would satisfy some people on one side. Other people they'd want something else. And the independent person who would set the number that would then allow us to balance the budget in 10 years or whatever and not monkey around would be something that would have to be agreed upon by the sides at the very beginning. And I don't see that ever happening when you're talking about congressional reform, Mr. Holtz. I watched the Transportation Committee take their money away from the Ways and Means Committee. They're over there monkeying around doing their whole thing. And everybody in the Congress has their jurisdiction. We don't want to give control to anybody else. So absent a solid number, I don't see how you ever get this. And I think the guys who put this country together realize that. They did not create a budget committee. It took till 1974, 227 years for us to get a budget committee. And we functioned because if we'd had a balanced budget amendment, how could Thomas Jefferson have bought the Louisiana Purchase? Or how could Lincoln have bought Alaska? I mean, how would all those things have happened if we got presidents out there doing all sorts of things and we're saying, well, we're going to balance the budget here? There's too much going on and nobody's serious about this, really, I don't think. Do you think we could ever get a mechanism in place that could be enforced?
You'd have to do something with mandatory spending. We did not have problems of chronic deficits until we invented mandatory spending programs. We went hundreds of years, annual appropriations were what they were, annual revenues were what they were. I don't think previous Congresses were smarter than the people we have now. They just adjusted and got it close to balance again and again and again. Once we created these autopilot big spending programs, we've now developed a chronic problem. So if you want to get something that gets us back to balance regularly, you're going to have to do something that controls the mandatory spending.
Let me take back my time.
Sure.
You keep coming back to mandatory spending. Did God say that it should be 20% of GDP that went into taxes? I mean, is that, I read the Bible and I went to Wheaton College and I know all about that stuff. I never saw that number in the Bible, that 20% of GDP is what taxes can be.
I think that's your colleague's numbers, not mine.
Or 30%? I mean, if you look at other countries in the world, they solve these kinds of problems by raising that percentage a little bit. And what I do not understand is people who want a balanced budget amendment at the same time don't want to have any new revenue. I really don't see it. We're going to do one in the Ways and Means Committee today. We're going to take money away from one bunch of poor kids and give it to another bunch of poor kids and say we've done something great. We've taken it away from foster kids, we've given it to abused kids because we have to have budget neutrality.
Expired. Thank you, sir. Gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Black, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this discussion is one that is needed. Unfortunately, since I've been here for 6 years, we seem to never really come to a conclusion. And I'm going to take my experience from having served at the state legislature back in the state of Tennessee, where we have a balanced budget amendment. And we did have an opportunity there to stay within the budget that was set and not continue to spend over what we were able to. And I would say, as a result of that, the state of Tennessee does pretty well. We have A+ ratings for our bonds, and we don't borrow a lot of money. So when I come here to Washington and I hear people say, no, a balanced budget amendment is not the deal, it wouldn't work, we shouldn't do it, it's not written in the Bible somehow, whatever, I can tell you that in the state of Tennessee it worked. So my question is, for you, Mr. Holtz-Eakin, because you have referenced this several times, is, yeah, we could have a balanced budget amendment, we could pass it, but we're still going to have some heavy discussion with the mandatory spending about how we ever get to that point where we could balance our budget. And debt to GDP is absolutely something that we have to worry about because if you're an economist, which I'm not, you will be told that if we don't get that under control, we are going to have real problems in about another 10 years. That's not very far down the line. So politically, this is going to be hard to do if we start looking at these mandatory programs. It's a tough thing. We could put a balanced budget amendment in place thinking that, oh, that's going to take care of all the problem. But Mr. Holtz-Eakin, politically, with where we are with our mandatory spending being 2/3 of what is actually our budget each year, but what politically can we do if we were to, let's say, everybody says, oh, yeah, that's the way to go, we ought to put some controls on this, because if we don't have controls, it's going to continue to be out of control. What do we have to do in order to convince the American public that we've all got to come together and hold arms together and take care of this problem, this situation?
I think there are two things that are pretty important in that regard. The first is some genuine public education about the fact that these aren't programs that the United States should be proud of. This is a great country. We should have a great social safety net. The Social Security program is kept solvent on the government's books by planning. It's the law of the land to cut benefits 25% across the board in under 2 decades. It's a horrible way to run a pension program, and no one should be proud of that. And so we need a better Social Security program. It's not a matter of just cutting because green eye shades people like me want to have the numbers line up. It's about having programs that are serving the beneficiaries well. Look at Medicare. The gap between payroll taxes and premiums coming in, spending going out, is about $300 billion a year. We get 11,000 new beneficiaries every day. That program's going to fall under its own financial weight, which we might be willing to do if it was delivering very high quality care at reasonable cost. It's not. So let's get a program where seniors can get care in their home, can get preventive care, avoid expensive acute care visits, and is sustainable over the long run. You don't want to have their program fall apart. So I think the first thing is some education about these programs and how they could be better, and they should be better. I think the second thing to recognize is there's never before been people who wanted entitlement reform. The only people who wanted entitlement reform were people like me, the budget people. And we're not a big caucus, so no one's really pushed for it. Right now, there's a real understanding in the defense community and in the non-defense communities that there's no money for them unless there's entitlement reform. And so, unlike the past, the politics are going to change, because when people go home and say something about entitlements, not everyone's going to say, oh, that's a horrible idea. Some people are going to say, thank you, we need the help.
Ms. MacGuineas, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, well, I want to weigh in on back to the fiscal goal and the mandatory spending and thinking about how all these things come together. And I want to share with you one of the most useful and interesting and really inspiring things I've done while in this job is I've worked with members of Congress with a budget simulator that we have. And it was a bipartisan, it's always bipartisan groups, and we've sat down and we've worked through all the budget options. And one of the reasons I like doing this with bipartisan groups is it really helps the sides understand where each other are coming from. And it seems to me that if the Budget Committee or other groups who wanted to take this budget simulator and privately, it's not a big public, let the press in, but work through these issues, there are a lot of things you'd find. And one of them, I think, is because mandatory spending has not been addressed for so long, we cannot achieve very aggressive fiscal goals in the short term, because all of you on both sides of the aisle don't want to really change beneficiaries' benefits immediately. We want to give people time to adjust. We want to protect retirees, which means we may need to have 2 fiscal goals. One, getting the debt to a reasonable level, maybe in 10 years, and then after that, balancing the budget over a business cycle or something else. But one idea I have, listening to all of you, is do an exercise like this, where you actually work through the policies and see how far we could get in 10 years and 20 years, and see if that helps come up with some shared goals.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Pasquale is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Question I have is, are we capable of coming up with a solution to one of the questions posed today? I think we are. There is hope in the valley. If we put these 3 folks, who I consider personally experts in the field, in a room, and leave them to discuss these issues, I think they would have great recommendations for us. Now, the question would be if we would accept the recommendations. I don't know if we're capable of accepting recommendations. Sometimes we are. Sometimes we do our job, believe it or not. I would like to give the 3 panelists an assignment. And my assignment to you is that you got to read, by the next time we meet in the Valley, what Alexander Hamilton put together. in 1790, the first report on the public debt, on public credit. I think it's a fascinating piece because we have made, Mr. Chairman, debt this huge dinosaur that nothing good comes out of it. There is some good that comes out of debt. In fact, Hamilton recommended that the federal government assume the credit after the war of all the states. And how were they going to do this? They were going to build credit. They were going to borrow to do it. Say, oh my God, the federal government, and we're trying to get the federal government even further away from looking at the responsibilities to the states or to the localities. So I think these three folks understand the conflicts, the innuendos, in terms of what Hamilton put together. All debt is not bad. I mean, we do it in our own families. We buy things on credit, or else we don't have them. Now, my mother and father did not believe in credit. God bless them. May they rest in peace. And I love them dearly for what they taught me. And you may say, Mr. Chairman, they didn't teach me well. But the fact of the matter is, I think you understand the point that I'm trying to make. Look, we could not have gotten out of the 2007, and Mr. Eakin, I have the greatest respect for you. You and I don't agree on much, but I have the greatest respect for you. In the 2007, 2008, 2009 really deep recession, which divided our country besides putting it into economic paralysis, the private sector did not come forth with the solutions or the capital or the money to begin to bail us out. There are some on this very committee who believe there's no role for the federal government in these. We've got to do it through the private market, for the marketplace. It is not done that way alone. We need the private marketplace. We need to get it up and moving again. And that's why both Republicans and Democrats, who were leaders of this country in 2007, 2008, 2009, came together somewhat, believe it or not, and made some very good proposals. It's possible. It's possible. Don't forget, when people are talking about the gross domestic product. My friend, I'm sorry, left, my good friend, Mr. From Virginia. The gross domestic product has increased since this administration, and I have not been a defender of everything this administration has proposed in terms of getting us out of the hole, 14.2%. Now, that's not very much, but when you go back to how many jobs and how much of the GDP was lost in the last quarter of President Bush's administration, it was some progress. It was some progress. We are capable of this. So I am tired of the presidential candidates, the congressional candidates, always talking about doomsday around the corner. We could do this if we put it into perspective. And you're talking, all three of you, about some very philosophical ideas. And Mr. Chairman, that helps us put things into context. I'm sorry, we don't have to get down into the nitty-gritty in the weeds to move America forward. We've increased the gross domestic product 14.2%, and we have. Now you talked about 38,000 jobs last month. That last month is terrible.
Has.
But compared to where we were,
expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk about sustainability, and I think the popular notion is that it's about 60% of GDP. Do you, Ms. MacGuineas, have a different number?
I do not have a different number. We ran a commission, the Peterson-Pugh Commission, about 5 years ago that looked at debt targets and tried to pick the right number. At the time, we ended up with 60%. And the reason was not because there's magic about that number, but because it was accepted in the broader global community. Mm-hmm. I think, unfortunately, debt levels are higher now, so it may be somewhat higher, but that's where we settled when we
somewhat
looked at it.
Higher. The May 24th publication from the St. Louis Federal Reserve shows that our debt to GDP for the first quarter of this year is 105.7%. Is that sustainable?
That's total debt, and we were actually talking about debt held by the public.
Okay, debt held by the public. Well, here's the thing, is that we talk about our debt. And being on the Budget Committee, I realize that most of what we deal with is within discretionary spending. We're not able to really do anything with the mandatory spending, and that's what worries me. If you look at the total debt at 106% of GDP, and then you add to that some of our unfunded liabilities, and I'm not going to talk about the total unfunded liability for Social Security, just the funding gap, which is $13.4 trillion. That's 75% of GDP. Does that bother you, Mr. Holtz-Eakin? The hospital insurance component of Medicare, that gap, $3.2 trillion. That's 18% of GDP. Then you take into account the unfunded liabilities for federal pensions, including civilian and military, and that's $3.5 trillion. That's 20% of GDP. That's 113% of GDP, and that's money we got to come up to in a relatively short amount of time, okay? We talk about in 10 years we're in trouble. I think we're in trouble now. How do you respond to that, Mr. Holtz-Eakin?
I don't disagree. I think we have a problem right now. We should recognize it and change direction as quickly as possible.
Well, you know, with all due respect to my friend from New Jersey, I do think debt is an issue. I ran a state-based think tank for years and worked on pensions. Moody's came out about 2005, 2000, somewhere in there, maybe been 2010, I can't remember the exact date, and said they were going to tie state bond ratings to their unfunded liabilities. If that were to happen in the United States government, we couldn't borrow money. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I'm worried about the pace at which the spending's growing. I'm not a big fan of unfunded liability calculations for the federal government, and here's why. First of all, they're not liabilities. These are programmatic decisions we can make, and you can change. Let me finish. Second is, calling them unfunded suggests that somehow you just need to fund them, and they're too large to be funded in any realistic sense. You cannot tax right out of the base.
I actually agree with you. I think you're making a great point, and it plays, and I actually agree with my friend from New Jersey, that this is not a problem we can't deal with.
Yes, you can deal with
The
it.
issue is, when do we start trying to deal with it? And the sooner, the easier it is, and I'm not saying it's going to be easy.
Right.
But we have to acknowledge what our problems are.
If I could say one more thing, because
Absolutely.
it's on the topic of this hearing. Many times when I was a CBO and since, people have suggested putting into the budget something like an unfunded liability calculation. And the problem with that is things like, say, Medicare, which is growing at 6.4% over the 10-year horizon. To get that to actually be a number, you have to have some interest rate that's bigger than, it doesn't exist. So the only way to get a number is to assume at some point Medicare grows more slowly, and the number that you get depends on when it grows more slowly, how quickly it slows down. So it's entirely fictional and made up by the CBO director in the shower each morning. You can't really budget on that stuff. That's not a good idea.
And I don't disagree. But I do think you have to take into account the funding gap in Social Security and the funding gap in Medicare, and we have to deal with it, and we can't deal with it in the budgeting process that we undertake now. We can't get to those numbers, and we have to if we're going to. I'm a major proponent of Dr. Price's efforts, Chairman Price's efforts, to reform the 1974 Budget Act. But at some point, we've got to be honest about where we are, and we've got to make some tough decisions. But I think if we do, I agree with my friend from New Jersey, we can solve this problem. I yield it back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. I had a couple folks arrive, but apparently none desirous of asking any questions. Ms. McClintock, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I just wanted to pose 3 policy reforms that I think are essential and get your opinions on them. The first, obviously, is a balanced budget amendment. I am very concerned about measures that attempt to prejudge what future Congresses will be facing, setting the debt limit to a percentage of GDP, for example. It seems to me that a more appropriate way of doing that is simply to forbid any increase in the debt except for a specific purpose adopted by 3/4 of the Congress. Now, that trusts 3/4 of any future Congress to know a crisis when they see one. It also trusts 1/4 of a Congress to be able to resist a boondoggle. Would that be helpful in this situation? Mr. Holtz-Eakin?
So if you want to bind future Congresses, as I said, I think that's the only mechanism that we should contemplate. And, you know, having a supermajority out for extraordinary circumstances is exactly the right thing to include in there.
Okay, well, the second reform that I think is essential is simply to conform to our own rules on unauthorized appropriations. As you know, since 1837, the House rules have forbidden appropriations except for purposes authorized by law. We now routinely waive that rule to the point where more than a third of our discretionary spending is for unauthorized purposes. The authorization process is absolutely essential to review the efficacy of programs to determine whether we're getting what we're paying for or whether we still even need those programs. What would you recommend to force the issue?
I think you really should live by your rules, and I would hope that, you know, I know the House has task forces on reclaiming their Article I constitutional authorities. This is central to that. You should not spend any money on programs that have not been authorized, reauthorized, and have appropriate oversight.
Ms. MacGuineas?
Completely agree.
Third issue is changing one of our rules that I think is keeping us from addressing these issues, and that's the rule that forbids statutory changes to be made in appropriations bills. We've actually taken control of discretionary spending, brought it down rather substantially over the past 4 years. That's the spending directly under Congress's control. Unfortunately, the mandatory spending, and I'm referring now to the non-trust fund side of the mandatory spending, which is still about $1 trillion a year, grows automatically. It's made a mockery of all of Congress's attempts to control discretionary spending. And it seems to me that particularly in the current political environment, it is very difficult to get a freestanding statutory change in mandatory spending. But once the budget has been enacted, shouldn't we allow the individual authorizing committees to recommend statutory changes to bring our mandatory spending within the limits set by the budget and then tuck that into the appropriations bills as they're considered by the House?
I have no particular objection to that. I mean, I think the central issue is to make sure that the spending is vetted comprehensively, both discretionary plus mandatory, and that you get, you know, full votes on the floor of the House, that it's the will of the House to spend in this way. That's the central piece.
Spending is a very pleasant thing to do. People like to do that.
I know that.
Savings is much is much less pleasant. People don't like to do that. If you separate the two issues, the spending bills pass, the savings bills don't.
Right.
Putting them together in the same measure, I think, actually would allow Congress to stick to its own budget numbers. Ms. MacGuineas?
Well, I just wanted to float another idea because we're talking about fiscal goals and fiscal rules here. And so much of the problem that we face is because people like to spend, but they also like to promise to spend more in the future. It's become very popular not to increase spending now, but to promise more spending down the road. And that's a big problem with the mandatory spending and tax expenditures. I have been trying to come up with an idea where you actually have a requirement that you can't commit to higher levels of spending in the future than you're willing to pay for today. Mm-hmm. It doesn't seem appropriate that a budget commit more future resources than current taxpayers are willing to pay. So just as long as we're on the topic of fiscal goals and rules, I think this kind of intergenerational requirement might be something to consider as well.
I agree, and in balancing the budget, we're also then giving taxpayers accurate price signals of what their government actually is costing them. As long as we're able to put it on the credit card, taxpayers don't get an accurate picture. And so they can't make rational choices.
I agree with that. And that's another reason to have a fiscal goal, because it forces a discussion about trade-offs and deciding priorities and whether cost of things are worth it. And again, I would extend that time frame to look down the road as well and try to have that exercise for our future commitments.
Great. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I'm going to have to run, and I'm going to turn the presiding over to Mr. Rokita. But Ms. MacGuineas, I do want to take you up on the offer for the budget simulation.
Wonderful.
I'd like to put together a bipartisan group from the Budget Committee. Anybody interested, and we'll get together and turn the dials.
That would be great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Woodall, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I apologize for being late. Mainly, I just wanted to come by to say thank you for the educational role that each one of you plays. Fantastic that we're having a conversation talking about fiscal goals. Even better that folks have been involved in such an aggressive education conversation that we believe we need to talk about having fiscal goals. And just at the tail end, kind of a tangent, but I think we have won the debate of the conversation of whether or not spending needs to be investigated, whether or not the balanced budgets have some sort of merit, not in and of themselves, but to protect your ability to respond to crises in the future. What I don't understand is how we've lost the conversation, particularly on my side of the aisle, that says it's okay to borrow $544 billion in 2016, but it wouldn't be okay to raise taxes by $544 billion in 2016, knowing that every spending dollar that is borrowed is a tax increase on future generations. My question to you economically is, are we doing America a favor by borrowing rather than raising taxes today? What leads to a better economic outcome over the next decade? To have borrowed the $544 billion and invested it in wherever it's going today, or to have taxed the $544 billion to invest it wherever it is going today? I'm not asking the question about whether we're spending wisely. I'm asking the question about whether we're cash flowing wisely. And I'd start with the former CBO director.
I think an important part of that question is how you raise the taxes. I think it's almost without question that our tax code is not particularly pro-growth right now. If you had a tax reform that also raised additional revenues but had a more pro-growth foundation, I'd be a lot happier with that proposition.
Thank you.
This is probably not what I should say coming from a progressive organization, but I would say that right now, when interest rates are as low as they are and the economy is still struggling, I would recommend phasing tax increases gradually. I think you have a tool to be able to phase this, and I do think we need more revenues over the long term, but there's not a need to do all of that right now.
Maya?
I completely agree with Doug that it depends on what taxes you raise, and there are plenty of taxes that we could be looking at that would not be so detrimental to economic growth, and I think that would be wiser than the borrowing that we're enacting because we've already borrowed so much. I think the real damage is that this is on top of near record levels of borrowing.
Mr. Chairman, I would just say that when you have this kind of talent on your witness panel and your assumed liberals are saying, hey, don't raise taxes so fast, and your presumed conservatives are saying, you know what, there's some tax increases that could help the economy succeed, it really is confusing to me why we should not be more successful together here. And again, I want to finish where I started. What you all do in terms of education is just tremendously important. When I go out and talk about budgets and spending, I'm just a hardcore Republican from the Deep South. When you all go out and talk about it, you're bridge builders, you're consensus builders, you're folks who are more invested in a positive outcome for us all than the outcome of the next election. I wish my CEOs could spend more time focused on the next generation instead of the next quarterly report, and I wish we could spend more time focused on the next generation instead of the next election. I thank you for what you all do to make that possible.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman reminds me of the old Reese's commercials of getting chocolate and peanut butter and vice versa. But I am acting as chair now, and I know the chairman has asked his questions. However, I haven't, as a member of this committee, been able to have a chance to ask my questions. So I'm going to assert that privilege under the rules right now and take 5 minutes. Starting with Ms. MacGuineas. My colleagues across the aisle have said at the past few hearings that there is no problem with the budget process. It's just that Republicans are at fault for having yet to produce a budget this year or not wanting to do a budget. Has the effectiveness of the budget process in past years depended on which party controls Congress, or is it broken altogether?
Yeah, I think clearly there is a problem with the budget process no matter which party is in control. And we've seen that from missed deadlines, the inability to pass the budget, bad fiscal outcomes, a failure to look at the long term, not sufficient oversight. I could do the long list. It applies to both sides. I think it's very worthwhile to look at budget process. It will not replace policy, but it's clearly broken.
Roger. In your testimony, you mentioned a number of other countries in this regard that have instituted fiscal rules: Germany, Sweden, Norway, UK. I know that they're European countries that all have parliamentary systems. Is that a requisite for having such rules, a parliamentarian system?
I'm just going to say no, because we shouldn't have a parliamentarian system. So I want to believe that we can use budget process rules that will improve this without strengthening the executive or changing our political system. But it certainly has made it easier. We have a lot of battles politically, and the structure of our government doesn't make it easier, but I wouldn't change it.
Right. And is there any research around this specifically, or any of your research that?
All the research that the IMF has actually mounds of research, both on the fiscal rules and the effects of the political systems. And we have a paper, which I will send to anybody who's interested, on what's helped make effective fiscal turnarounds in different countries.
Including ones that aren't parliamentary systems?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be interested in having that.
Sure.
Thank you. On June 1st, you know, in my opinion, keeping with his disregard, really, for the future fiscal health of this country, President Obama spoke in favor of actually expanding Social Security benefits. Now, this comes after a Democrat-controlled Congress drastically expanded Medicaid, and the Democrat nominee for president proposed expanding Medicare for people 55 years of age and older. Of course, the age threshold now is 65. This seems to show that they have no interest in addressing what is really 2/3 now of our spending year to year. Now, can we achieve any reasonable fiscal goal without addressing entitlement reform?
Absolutely not. Entitlement reform is going to be central to reforms. I will start with that. I'm a political independent. My organization is bipartisan. And I very much share the disappointment that the president pivoted away from talking about entitlement reform as part of a grand bargain that would look at entitlements and revenues. And we were, years ago, really had, I think, a bipartisan consensus that changes had to be made on both sides of the budget, and they had to be large and structural. He then, when we weren't able to have a grand bargain, he, to his credit, included chain CPI in his budget, which was an important first step, and I thought a very good effort on his part. Was greeted with a lot of dissatisfaction on both sides of the aisle. I was sort of stunned to see both Republicans and Democrats not willing to look at that one as a very sensible policy. And his recent pivot to talking about expanding Social Security at a time when, as Doug pointed out, we face 21% across the board benefit cuts in not very long a way if we don't make the system solvent. And to talk about expanding the program, not targeting expansions. I think we should have benefit expansions for people who need them as part of a solvency plan.
Social
But
Security
broad-based,
disability reform that focuses on people who really need
and low end, at the low end, actually a minimum benefit when we make the program solvent. But to take resources away from other important priorities at a time like this when so many things are underfunded, the debt is at record levels, I find it fiscally very worrisome.
You mentioned that President Obama pivoted away from the grand bargain. Where do you get that data or that opinion from?
I spent a lot of time working on the grand bargain when people were working on it, and I know that both sides were working in earnest to try to come up with a compromise, and I thought that they were actually very close based on the work of Simpson Bowles and then what the leader and President Obama were doing. And unfortunately, there were a lot of reasons negotiations broke down, but I continue to think that a blueprint that's large enough to fix the problem and looks at all parts of the budget and is done in a bipartisan way, protects the vulnerable, and is cognizant of helping to grow the economy is the best path forward, and it was really too bad that opportunity was missed.
And in that grand bargain, if you read books like Mr. Woodward's, et cetera, it was the Speaker of the House at the time, Mr. Boehner, who I think actually agreed to a tax increase around that grand bargain. I mean, the grand bargain was the Republicans would be owning a tax increase.
The grand bargain would have required an increase in revenues, which was a big step.
And it was the president who, in your polite words, pivoted away from that.
With the failure of the grand bargain, the president has stopped pushing for fiscal policy, and again, to my disappointment, has focused on the short-term improvement in the deficit, which was never the problem, and has neglected the medium and long-term debt trajectory that we're on, which is a very dangerous problem that should concern both parties. It's not a political threat. It's an economic and intergenerational threat.
Yep. Well, I have to gavel myself. I have to gavel myself, and we're going to close.
Mr. Chairman?
We're going to recognize you for your closing statement. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I wanted to bring to everyone's attention legislation that has been introduced on the Social Security, to reform it, to move to a formula, new, the CPI, to pay for solvency over 75 years. There is a plan. We presented it. It should be bipartisan, but it is not. I don't think we have done enough work to make it bipartisan, to be very honest. See, that's one of our problems, Mr. Chairman. We want to be the authors. We want to be the kingmakers. And you have that problem on your side, too. When we could be working together on, look, we've never had a solution to Social Security unless it was both parties coming together. I don't care what you're, am I correct or not?
That's correct.
And we can do this. We can do this. So I'd ask you to look at the legislation. I'll bring it to you this afternoon.
I'm assuming the gentleman yields back with that?
I yield.
Okay, thank you. Of course we'll look at it. And for 5 years, we've had Medicare reform for the Democrats to look at in these budgets that have passed. We've had Medicaid reform for Mr. Pascal to look at. But they never seem to vote for those budgets. Yeah, so agreed, Mr. Pascal, we do have a problem. And we have a problem when we get so close in that quote-unquote grand bargain that when it really comes to it, and we had a chance for entitlement reform, even with a tax increase that was already agreed to by our leadership, the president, quote-unquote, pivoted away. That's the failure of leadership that we have. But leadership was not lacking here today, especially from our witnesses and the members who, as I understand, asked great questions throughout, and even from both sides of the aisle, and I appreciate that. I want to thank Dr. Holtz-Eakin, Ms. MacGuineas, and Mr. Stein, all for appearing before us today. Please be advised that members may submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record, and any members who wish to submit questions or any extraneous material for the record may do so within 7 days. Again, I thank the witnesses, I thank the members, and this, seeing no more business before this committee, this hearing is adjourned.